Who's Echo and what on earth is Echoism? You're probably familiar with the myth of Narcissus. Let's face it, the narcissuses of this world make sure we're very familiar with who they are. But there's other characters in the Narcissus story, and one of those characters is Echo. She's right there in that picture we all think about when we think about Narcissus. He's gazing at his own reflection in the water, completely obsessed with it. And there's Echo on the side, looking longingly at him. You get the sense in this picture that Echo really has no thought for herself. She is entirely and utterly smitten and focused on Narcissus. Echo's story is a really interesting one, and I think it can yield some really interesting insights into relationships where there's a lot of narcissism. And it may also point us to some ways we can heal and recover and grow out of these relationships. My name's Ruth Ann. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm an expert in relationships and narcissism. And in this video, I'm sorry, Narcissus, but I'm taking the attention away from you and I'm going to put it on Echo, even though Echo herself is probably very uncomfortable with that prospect. So let me tell you a little bit about Echo's story. Echo is a nymph. She's full of life. She's full of energy and vitality. And her and her friends like to play with the gods. And Zeus comes to Earth to play with the nymphs. And he's having a great time. His wife, Hera, gets suspicious. She comes to Earth to see what's going on. Echo, seeing Hera on the way, distracts her with incessant chatter. She chats and chats and chats and chats. And Hera, realizing that Echo is distracting her from what her husband is up to, is incandescent with rage. She curses Echo. She takes away her voice and makes it so that Echo can only repeat the last words that someone else has spoken to her. In essence, Echo can talk, but she can't speak for herself. So the concept of echoism kind of comes out of that story. It was really developed by a psychologist called Craig Malkin. And Craig Malkin's book, Rethinking Narcissism, is one of the best I've ever read on this issue. He doesn't know I'm recommending it. I'm not paid to recommend it, but there is a link in the description. Malkin argues that narcissism exists on a spectrum. At the top of the spectrum is the narcissism we're probably all quite familiar with. It's the people who are very comfortable to take up space, to be the center of attention, to get recognition. Maybe that is the kind of narcissism we're all familiar with, which is like being recognized for being the most successful, the most attractive, the most special person in the room. But it can also be kind of covert narcissism, which is simply being recognized for other things, maybe being recognized for the person who sacrificed the most, done the most, suffered the most, being the biggest victim. That's also a form of narcissism. So that's at one end of the spectrum. Now, in the middle of the spectrum is what Malkin calls healthy narcissism. And that's people who have healthy self-esteem, who see themselves in a positive light. They may see themselves in an overly positive light in comparison to reality, but that tends to serve them well. It makes them pretty positive. It makes them put effort in and work hard because they expect to get results. They also tend to see their partner and other people in a positive way, which is good for their relationships. They're responsive to feedback. And generally, when they do well, they take everyone else with them. And that's healthy narcissism. At the other end of the spectrum are echoists. And echoists simply don't have enough narcissism. Quite the opposite. They're terrified of taking up too much space, of being seen as needy, of being seen as greedy, being seen as demanding or arrogant or proud. And so they often have very low self-esteem. They keep themselves hidden. They're very focused on other people and other people's needs. They can be very empathic, listening and serving other people. They will often diminish their own accomplishment. Oh, it's no big deal. I didn't do that much. They really don't like to be recognized or seen. They can be kind of invisible. They also tend to have really poor boundaries, so it's difficult for them to say no or to ask for what they want because that would simply be too demanding or too needy. They often struggle with difficult feelings of anger, seeing it as something that they're really not entitled to feel or act upon. And they really see themselves as needing to serve other people. They find it really difficult to put on other people, and if ever they need to ask other people for something, they'll be incredibly apologetic for doing so. And if they've done something that maybe even just causes mild offense, or they get some critical feedback, they are intensely self-critical and incredibly apologetic for it. They just say sorry all the time. Now, as a phenomenon, let me be very clear. This is not a psychiatric diagnosis. This is not a mental disorder. It's really a set of traits and a way of thinking about a particular kind of difficulties. But it's a way of thinking about them that seems to resonate for quite a lot of people when they hear the concept. And I actually love sharing this concept with people because they're like, oh my God, that's me. And many of us can probably recognize ourselves in that description at some point. So for some of us, it might be something that just comes up in certain environments around someone who's very domineering, or in an environment that's very coercive or powerful, where we begin to feel small and diminished and a bit echoey. For other people, it is a pervasive pattern that exists in almost all their relationships. Now, when I work with people, I often see a kind of echoey flavor in people who may have had a parent who's highly self-absorbed, who's requiring the child to anticipate their needs and be very focused on them, and hasn't given their child the experience of being seen and heard and having a kind of healthy entitlement and being seen as special and celebrated for just being who they are. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is this is exactly the environment that can also cause someone else to become quite narcissistic, as a kind of way of rebelling against that environment or overcompensating for it. And that's likely to be something to do with a combination of that person's innate temperament and the environment in which they find themselves. I also see the same phenomenon in people who have been in romantic relationships or even in a workplace context with a highly narcissistic person, maybe a narcissistic partner or a narcissistic boss. And in those contexts, even if they've not previously struggled with issues of echoism, they may find themselves losing touch with themselves, losing touch with their own strengths, their own opinions, their own ability to think for themselves, speak for themselves, and hold their boundaries. And sometimes you will see that when people leave those relationships or those workplaces, it's kind of interesting how quickly for some people they reconnect with themselves and the bits of themselves that they may have lost in those relationships. For others, it becomes a much more pervasive pattern where it's very difficult for them to get in touch with themselves, and very difficult for them to express their own opinions, their own wants, wishes, needs, boundaries are really, really tough. I also sometimes see this phenomenon in people who've been in very domineering institutions and cultures. So, for example, very authoritarian religious groups where there's a lot of dogma and people are taught how they must think, how they must act, and thinking for yourself and being in touch with your own wants and wishes is simply not permissible within that environment. It can happen in powerful institutions, in workplaces, where there is a culture of dominance and control and coercion, where again people become quite repressed and really struggle to have their own voice and have their own say. So if you recognize yourself in the description of echoism, what can you do? Well, I think echoism exists on a spectrum, and for some people, they'll be able to help themselves and grow on their own. Other people who may have experienced more extreme narcissistic abuse may really struggle with this and need some extra help, maybe from a therapist who's experienced in working with survivors of narcissistic abuse. Now, very often people who are high in echoism can find themselves in relationships with people who are very high in narcissism. And there can really be a bit of a draw between those two characters, those two personality styles. So the person who's very high in echoism doesn't want to take up space, doesn't want to be seen, doesn't want to be heard. So they're very happy to surrender that to the person who's highly narcissistic. And the person who's highly narcissistic is only too happy to take up all the space, take up all the room, and be the one in control. But that is a very, very high price to pay. And of course, it's only going to make things worse in terms of being in touch with yourself, who you are, your likes, your dislikes, and being seen. But trying to become less echoey in relationship with a narcissist is a bit like trying to learn to swim when you've fallen off a cruise ship in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a sea. This is incredibly difficult. So I'm going to give you some pointers of ways where you can start that are a little bit easier and a lot safer. So kind of like learning to swim in the shallow end of the local swimming pool where there's no sharks and no storm. Some of the things I suggest to people who are very high in echoism to really help them get in touch with themselves are to begin to pay attention to themselves And we can start with easier things. We can start with paying attention to what you find pleasurable or enjoyable. And it's kind of really interesting. I suggest to people, I want you just to go off and act like you're starting a relationship with yourself, that you're in the earlier stages of dating and you just want to get to know you for you. So be really interested, be really curious, and really set about getting to know yourself. And so we can start with paying attention to pleasure and enjoyment. It doesn't have to be difficult. Although I will say, for someone who's very high in echoism, this is a really difficult challenge. But when I see people do this and they really embrace it, and they really get on board with it, I often see people flourish in ways they never imagined possible before. And it can be a beautiful thing to really see someone unfold in front of you. So I often suggest to people they start with a task like going out and trying some new foods and really paying attention to flavor, to temperature, to texture, and to just the whole sensation, to smell, to appearance, and really treat it as a very sensory experience and begin to pay attention. Now, the idea here is not about finding new foods that you like, although that might happen. It's actually developing the skills of paying attention to your own internal experiences. And that can be really fun and really enjoyable. And you can start to find what you really like. And you can do this in other ways too. You can look at what's recommended for you in Spotify and begin to listen to new music and pay attention to what rhythms do you like, what sounds move you, what lyrics touch you and resonate for you. And you can build playlists that are really based on your own personal taste. You can also do things like go clothes shopping and try on different styles and see what you like. Try things out. Just have fun and get in touch with who you are. Can also, and I love suggesting this to people, go on a date with yourself. So take yourself off to somewhere that you find personally appealing. It could be a city, it could be a museum, it could be just something that you're interested in. Go take yourself out on that date by yourself and just do what pleases you. Now, often when people do this, they're like, I'm a little bit lost. I don't know what to do. That's okay. You want to tolerate that feeling and get familiar with it and practice. And gradually you'll find that you do get in touch with yourself and what you like, and you really get to know yourself in a new way. Now, then I tend to ask people to up the ante a bit. I make it a little bit more difficult because we're going to start letting other people get to know the real you. And so sometimes that can be starting to just express an opinion with friends or at work. And it can be really simple. It can be like if your friends are choosing to go out for a meal, you could say, I would really like to go out for Indian food, or I would really like to go for pizza. Now, it doesn't mean that you expect your friends to do what you want. It's just throwing your opinion into the ring as something to consider. And it can be really wonderful for people to actually learn that very often their friends are really interested in what they have to say and what they want, and are often very keen to accommodate them. Can also be things like expressing what movie you'd like to see, or expressing an opinion on something that you like or dislike, or sharing with your friends the new food you've tried, the new top you've bought, or the new music you've listened to. And so that, again, is just letting people get to know you. And very often this can really help to develop your relationships in new ways. Very often people high in echoism also need to work on boundaries, on asking for things and saying no to things that are a little bit more tricky. I often suggest to people a really, not so fun experiment, to be honest. I suggest to people that they go to a cafe or a restaurant and they order something from the menu, but with several modifications. Now, this is tough because echoists do not like to put people out. So this is a really, really tough challenge. And I'll be honest with you, it's one I've done myself and I really hate it. But it's also something that's really important to learn from, because you learn to say what you want and you also learn how other people respond to it. Sometimes the waiting staff might be a little bit irritated at the request, but the vast majority of the time, people are pretty accommodating and willing to do what you would prefer and what would please you. You can also begin to say no to people in your personal life if they ask you for something. Or you can also start to ask people for things that you might need or find beneficial. These are difficult tasks, and they can be very challenging to someone who's really not used to paying much attention to themselves, and even less used to being able to express what they want or need to other people. But they're really valuable relationship skills, and they're really the foundation of healthy relationships where you can be seen and heard, as well as seeing and hearing the person that you're with. I hope this video gives you some ideas and things that you might be able to take forward. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you identify with the concept of echoism? Does it resonate for you? And are there ways that you found to become less echoey? I'd love to hear what you think, so please do leave a comment. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. I look forward to seeing you next time. And in the meantime, take good care.